piece of spaghetti on your overalls.
Luigi. When it comes to storytelling, its main priority should always be to engage the audience as if they're a part of the story's world themselves. And the best way a story can do this is by using a sense of familiarity. This way, the viewer can think to themselves, hey, I can kind of relate to this story a bit. Probably. And that's where this all really ties into, how a story can use relatability to make itself more enjoyable. Now, there are a lot of ways this feeling can be implemented, through the adventure, the setting, the conflict, or even the resolution. But the true driving force for relatability comes from arguably the most important aspect, the characters. You see, characters are like gateways for the audience to actually feel like they're a part of the story themselves. Of course they're not, because that would just be plain silly. But my point is, using relatable characters is one of the cornerstones for making a good story. Although at the end of the day, this all stems from one thing: experience. As the great Captain Rex once said, in my book, experience outranks everything. Wise words from a clone. While people can relate to a character's experience in something like a book or a movie or even in music, I feel that same sense of relatability can also exist with video game characters as well. Now, before you all make fun of me for how autistic that statement was, let me explain. Video games, depending on how they tell their story, can have a much more unique way of portraying characters. Sometimes their personalities can be more subtle and only told through other characters or by specific set pieces, while other times they can be at the forefront of the experience and act as a significant part of the story. Of course, there are plenty of exceptions to this, like I don't know who could relate to a purple dragon voiced by SpongeBob or an anthropomorphic blue hedgehog that collects rings. But depending on how a game portrays itself, their characters have the potential to be personified in one way or another. However, if we're talking about relatability, then it goes without saying that one character in particular has been the absolute poster child for an entire generation of horribly oppressed gamers. You know him, you love him, you probably don't. Give it up for Luigi. Now, every player 2 in existence is more than familiar with Luigi, the high-jumping, slippery-footed, and very weak-chinned little brother to that fat bastard Mario. And while he's always been by Mario's side since their very first game, Luigi has always found himself in his brother's shadow. Because it's always been Mario who saves the princess, or Mario who gets everything named after him, or Mario who is in the butt of everybody's jokes in the Superstar Saga games. Meanwhile, Luigi was only ever busted out when there was an extra controller and your parents forced your older brother to let you play. But at the same time, it wasn't like Luigi had much going for him either. With the exception of Mario 2, Luigi never had much to personify himself outside of a color palette swap. He was always just there, and it was to a point where even for a sidekick it was pathetic. You know, say what you want about characters like Tails or Diddy Kong, at least those two were distinct in both their personalities and abilities. Luigi was nothing more than just a hollow husk of a man stuck behind the greatness of his brother for all eternity. Ugh. Yeah, in all honesty, by this point, Luigi was just a lost cause. Aside from his continuous absence in most of the mainline games, he just seemed to be turning into a secondary character that was only ever invited to party games, further cementing the theory, the game theory, that Nintendo didn't give a shit about this loser anymore. Or so we thought. Oh, fuck, I hit the mic. Flash forward to the year 2001, where it's time for Nintendo to unveil their newest console, the GameCube. Which, you know, was cool and all, but aside from it looking like a lunchbox, what people really cared about were its games. Cause I mean, after people spent the past 5 years playing some of the most wonky and awkwardly designed games ever, I'm sure they were more than pleased to finally get their hands on games that were more sure of themselves, to put it lightly. Although this is Nintendo we're talking about, of course, and when it comes time for them to show off their launch titles, they do what they do best, and worst, and surprise us. Cause every console prior has always had a Mario game to coincide with its launch, which, you know, makes sense seeing as how he's their biggest franchise. But when it came time for the GameCube, Nintendo decided otherwise and thought, instead of releasing a Mario game, why not release a Luigi game? Now, of course, everyone in the boardroom or whatever laughed in unison at this idea due to the fact that Luigi was still a nobody. So how could Nintendo possibly devise a game game that would not only act as a system seller, but would also star this loser character at the same time? Well, the answer is simple. You take Luigi, you put him in a mansion, and next thing you know, you got one of the best games ever made. Luigi's Mansion is the quintessential example of a spin-off. It creates a completely new world with its own distinct tone and style, while at the same time exploring new themes and mechanics that were never experimented with before. No longer were you trying to reach the end of a stage or collect an absurd amount of power stars. Instead, you're hunting down ghosts with your mom's vacuum cleaner. And it's fucking amazing! The entire game is ingeniously focused around this mechanic, as it's really your only ability. While that may sound like it gets boring and repetitive, it's in the way the game uses said mechanic that makes it interesting. From capturing ghosts, to finding treasures, to using element attacks, to screwing around with curtains, to scaring your animals. Honestly, this is the first game I've ever played that makes doing chores fun. But putting aside the masterpiece that is Luigi's Mansion's gameplay, let's transition into the real focus of this video. How this game made Luigi not suck ass anymore. As mentioned before, prior to this game's release, Luigi was the definition of irrelevant. Not only did he lack a personality of his own, but was slowly fading back into the dark hole from which he crept out of. So when it came time for him to star in his own game, Nintendo decided, instead of making Luigi just another perfect and strong Chad of a protagonist, he'd be the biggest goddamn pussy ever. And you know what? That's a good thing. Because the game plays on his character to not only give Luigi himself a personality, but the entire game a personality as well. See, Luigi's Mansion came out at a time where games were becoming more personified through not only the characters themselves, but also with dialogue and even the world itself. And this game is no exception. Everything is given so much life that it's able to tell such a thematic story just through behaviors and snarky comments. Of course, a lot of that expression does come at Luigi's expense, but that just plays on the whole idea of him being the ultimate underdog. Every time someone undermines Luigi in this game, it doesn't put him down or discourage him. He stands with his head high and says to himself, yeah, that's kinda true. And the reason this is so important is because of how Luigi's little quest here perfectly resembles the struggles of Player 2's everywhere. Your whole life you were treated like a nobody just because you weren't number one. But finally, after years of living on the sidelines, it was your time to shine. And it just so happens that instead of saving a princess, you're saving the person you've been living in the shadows of all this time. Justice has been served. Well, except for the fact that right after this, Luigi forgets to show up in Mario Sunshine, even though the final boss in this game does. But it's the small victories, you know? However, for all the amazing things Luigi's Mansion does for him in the moment, in my eyes, what's more important is what the game did for him in the long run. Let me explain. Now that Luigi was given an identity of his own, Nintendo began to base many of his cameos and representation as a whole around it. This means instead of Luigi being just there, he now actually contributes something thanks to his newfound recognition. In fact, to use an example, let's take his appearances in the first 3 Smash games to show you what I mean. In Smash 64, he was nothing more than a Mario clone that recycled so many of his assets that he didn't even have his own voice clips. Then in Melee, it got a bit better, but that was really only because of this. But then in Brawl, not only was he given his own voice, he was given brand recognition through the Luigi's Mansion stage. Now to some, that may seem pretty small, seeing as how it's only one stage out of... Wait, hold on. How many stages were in... 41, but when you take into consideration how Luigi went from being an Echo Fighter before they were cool, to now having his series be considered important enough to warrant a stage being made out of it, that's very cool. And I know what you're... Oh, fuck, I dropped my script. And I know what you're all probably thinking. Luigi's Mansion basically predates both Melee and 64, so there's no way he could have had anything special in them. And to that I say, yeah, You're right. It's just impressive to see how far Luigi has come in that time span. In fact, if you really think about it, Luigi has done nothing but improved as a character since his first game. Aside from his newly developed personality, he's begun appearing more often in main series games and actually making it worth his while. Like the times he was made playable as a reward for beating a campaign, or when he made coin farming much easier in Odyssey so you wouldn't have to go back to that same goddamn spot in Steam Garden over and over again just so you could afford the skeleton costume. And that's not even mentioning some of his biggest accolades. From starring in more solo adventures, to even having an entire year be dedicated to him by Nintendo. And, of course, Luigi's Mansion 3. But suffice to say, Luigi is a changed man. Now, it's hard to say if Nintendo had this mentality of characterizing Player 2 when developing Luigi's Mansion, because a lot of the time when they do something cool like this, it's usually by complete accident. Let's be real. But coming from someone who's been a lifelong Player 2, the reason this game resonates with me so much is because of what it stands for. That being expanding on a character people like me were more than familiar with, even though he had as much personality as a wet tissue. I know I'm probably sounding like a news reporter with a stutter at this point, but this game is just too goddamn good. Aside from what I've highlighted in this video, nearly every aspect from its gameplay to its level design to its atmosphere and tone are molded to near perfection. So to any other Player 2s out there who've yet to play Luigi's Mansion, consider this to be your little after-school PSA as to why you should hop on that shit. You may have suffered many hardships in the past, but I assure you, now is your time. Unless your brother hogs the Dolphin emulator and prevents you from actually playing. Which, at that point is when you kneecap the motherfucker. Anyways, play the game or don't. I don't care. Bye.